Before us is a set of legislation or bill that does satiate my intellectual, spiritual, and moral delectation and guzzlement. I say that, sir, in fact, let me explain what I mean. That I come here and I'm standing here speaking on something that is dear to my heart. And that is our relationship with the African continent. And I stand here proud because whatever happens, I would be part of a piece of legislation that enacts it. I also say, Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, that I listened to Senator Rogers this morning, and I would have said to him, as Agrippa said to Paul, John, you want to make me a Christian. You almost made me a Christian. But equally, sir, I'm disappointed. I am disappointed because of the apparent reference to skepticism. There is, and we see it a lot on social media, that when there is a matter before us, there is always this feeling that there's something underneath, that there's something, that is not the real thing, that there's something underneath. I do not remember what Jonathan Sachs refers, how he refers to it, but I'm sure by the time the cyber bill comes, sir, I will be able to speak to it, to remember that term. And we must trust one another. Sir, in 2015, and I like to speak from my heart sometimes, I was diagnosed with a cancerous tumor in my throat. And many Barbadians were saying to me, go overseas and get a second opinion. And I called my sister in Canada, Winnipeg. And she's one of those sweethearts, so that if she tells me to jump, I would ask, how high? And she contacted a friend, and the friend told her, tell him to remain in Barbados, he will get some of the best treatment, despite all that's going on. And I must confess, I did not only get the best treatment, but I also obtained a friend. And I speak of no other than Senator Christopher Maynard. So I want to look at this issue this afternoon in terms of, first I want to look at the context. I want to look not only at the regional context, but the global context in which this has come. But also let me say that there were times sitting in the High Commission, the Barbados High Commission in London, and listening to local programs, especially some of these calling programs, especially from other persons who would not try to educate themselves on such international matters. I heard people saying that the Prime Minister, Mark Lee, is always traveling all over the world. So you cannot sit now in these little countries and expect to run the country. You must get into there with those, what we call the big boys, and speak for yourself and argue for yourself. And what we are saying here today, sir, is a culmination of the efforts of Prime Minister Martin. I also want to say that here we are today speaking on a piece of legislation that seeks to establish relationships between the African continent and Barbados and the Caribbean. This year, sir, we are celebrating the bicentennial anniversary of the establishment of the Anglican Church. I don't think it's a coincidence, I think it may be a godsend that we have two Anglican priests here in these chambers. And that the bishop of the Anglican Church also sat in this chamber. And therefore, I still think that there's that connection between church and state, even though they are separate, and they must remain separate. So we have this contribution to make as well. But sir, I believe this bill comes at a time when certain countries must determine, and indeed they are determining their futures, and especially those with whom they trade and how they trade. I say this because when we look at the global context, globalization itself, though it has some positives, have not benefited every country, and especially countries like Barbados and our counterparts in the Caribbean. There's no doubt in my mind that globalization is bringing, and has brought as well, nations closer than ever before. There's national, regional, and international levels. All of these have been intertwined inextricably. But on the other hand, there's a type of tribalism that are ripping nations apart and keeping them apart. And as we say in Barbados, every man bread for himself. And while there may be significant positives of globalization, the negatives are startling. The global economy, sir, is still, in my view, a state of collapse. There's no doubt that climate change is having a negative impact on economies, and there's much uncertainty. In fact, this uncertainty is constitutive of the human condition. There's a swift change with internet. Change is part of life. And with this change, there's flux and uncertainty. In the words of Matthew Arnold, we seem to be caught between two worlds, one dead and the other powerless to be born. And therefore, developing countries must chart their own path. And that path, sir, should no longer be based on dependency, but on cooperation. And they exist not based on competition, because competition still seems to be ruling the world. And in my view, this bill now seeks to help us to cooperate in partnership with the African continent. And that is why the word partnership here is so important to me. I'm impressed with the word partnership between member states of this agreement. And I'm believing, sir, that with partnership we can succeed, because I do not believe that the world can succeed on competition alone. There are people who believe, if we may put this in a theoretical context, there are people who believe that competition is progress. This globalized world is still based on hierarchy. This bill suggests partnership. So there are those who will believe from time immemorial that competition is the way to go. Charles Darwin, in The Origin of the Species, argued that it was a struggle for survival in the face of finite resources. That natural selection explains the cause of evolution. Social, and I said I'm looking at it first in a theoretical context. Social Darwinists like Herbert Spencer maintain that the same law of survival apply to societies and cultures. Globalists argue that the maximization of competition through finance should be recognized, and world markets is in the turbocharged motor of the wealth of nations. And what has competition done to this world? It has brought wealth for the fittest, and the other countries are left to survive. I have realized, sir, that inequalities are inherent in capitalism. In fact, it seems as though capitalism cannot exist without these disparities. And these disparities also exist in our globalized world. They still exist in our globalized world. So I look at what advantages that our Caribbean, this country and the Caribbean, would achieve from a relation in partnership with the African Export-Import Bank. I don't know, there are others who prefer not to call it a bank. I don't know what else to call it, but I can only talk about what is here before me. The whole idea of the facilitation of trade. Finance facilities are provided. It promotes economic integration, and we are talking about integration all over the world. Why not talk about integration with the African continent? It talks about attracting foreign investment, stimulating economic growth. Don't we need all of these things? Are these things not important to us? Capacity building and technical assistance. So the good thing about all of this, about this relationship, is that it is based on a relationship of equality. It is based not on hierarchy, but it is also based on trust and not dependency. There was a time when the relationship between Africa and the Caribbean was one that was forced on us by an outsider. We all know what happened in the slave trade. And Africa suffered from some of the same things that we did, that we suffered from. For example, let me give an example. When the Europeans went to Africa, they would take some of their textile, their low-grade textile to Africa. And some Africans would go after it. Because why? It came from overseas. So that happened there. We have millions who were forced to leave Africa, especially West Africa, and come to the Caribbean. The good thing about this, sir, is that it covers the African continent. They were forced, they were transported. They came to the Caribbean and they worked from can't see in the morning to can't see at the night. And we did not benefit from that African, Caribbean, and European relationship. Neither Africa nor the Caribbean. But however they try to put it, and you will find that many theses now are written on the relationship between the Caribbean and its contribution to the British economy. But there was no equality in that. It was forced. But we are saying now, with our African counterparts, we are working with you based on trust and based on partnership. And I ask myself some questions about this relationship. Which I will answer shortly. There was a time, or in fact, there is a time that we borrow. And that borrowing necessitated or is necessitated on what goes on in the global market. It seems as though mankind is created to serve markets. The market is very good. It is very good at creating wealth, but it is very poor at distributing that wealth. Markets are the best way we know of structuring exchanges, goods bought and sold. But the market is very poor at preserving goods, the values of which are not identical with their price. And then societies encompass choices, and these choices cannot be settled by the market alone. So I ask myself these questions in our relationship with our African counterparts. With our relationship with the African Export-Import Bank, will it enhance human dignity? Yes, it does. It will. Will it encourage creativity? Yes, it will. Will it allow everyone to participate in the material blessings of the world? Yes, it will. Does it sustain a climate of equal regard for employers as well as employees, for the poor, the unfortunate, the aged, for those vulnerable persons in our society? Will it do that? Yes, it does. Does it protect the vulnerable and help those in need to escape the trap of need? Yes, it does. Does it ensure that no one lacks the means for a dignified existence? Yes, it does. Does it offer opportunity for those who succeed to share the blessing with those who have less? Yes, it does. Does it strengthen the bonds of human solidarity? Yes, it does. That is why we have a relationship now, sir, between Africa and the Caribbean. Does this partnership realize that there's more to life than striving after wealth, and that this is not a means, that this is just, it is a means to an end and not just an end in itself? Yes, it does. I believe that this may just be the starting point, that we can go further, and at some point we can establish direct air links with Africa. I hope to be certainly part of any chamber that says, today we have come to establish this. So let us not be skeptics. Let us put our trust and work in a spirit of cooperation, sir, because that is where we have to go, work in a spirit of cooperation. You see, sir, one man may not stand a chance facing a lion, but 10 men together may put the lion in its place. And that is why we need partnerships like these. That is why we need to cooperate. That is why we need to go beyond the traditional methods of acquiring income, of acquiring economic activity. And therefore, sir, I stand to lend my wholehearted support to this legislation that is before us. I thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Rogers. Senator Kevin Boyce.
Thank you, Mr. President. I genuinely had no intention, but I was inspired. I was inspired by Senator Morris's contribution, sir. And allow me to present, idealistically, a counterpoint with regard to the narrative that we have heard here today. There can be no doubt that all of us here in this chamber support the concept of strengthening the ties with the motherland. There can be no doubt that we see it as a step that is progressive and the culmination of years of efforts and putting into reality something that our ancestors perhaps only dreamed of. We sit and we stand and we debate here as a Senate in Barbados, and we try our best to make contributions that set out our beliefs with regard to what is being done. So when I hear the Senator Morris speak about skeptics, it moved me, as some would say, the Spirit tends to move us. And I said, let me go on, go back to the definition. What's the root? So perhaps offer a counterfactual as to, well, instead of shunning the skeptics, we in a democracy, maybe we embrace them. Maybe we engage them. I believe the Prime Minister called it active citizenry, Senator Morris. But a skeptic is defined as a person inclined to question or doubt accepted opinions. That's the noun. Philosophically, and I have been encouraged by my seniors to try to create my own personal philosophy, so I'm still growing in this field. But philosophically, a skeptic denies the possibility of knowledge, certain knowledge, or rational belief as an accepted truth. Scientifically, we all know that skeptics are the ones that evaluate the research without any prejudice or bias. That is what scientifically it is. And when we have what my friend Senator Nichols loves to speak of, a dialectic process, you have the different perspectives, the push and the pull and the tug. So should we not listen to the skeptics, Mr. President? Indeed, sir, we all remember the famous children's story about the skeptic who said, but the emperor ain't got no clothes. That's something we were all taught. That was a skeptic. Was there not a time, sir, when it was skepticism? Was there not a time, sir, when there was skepticism to say that we should be independent? That was against the accepted colonial mindset. Was there not a time, sir, when it was skepticism to say that there should be full adult suffrage? That was against the established practice as to being a certain amount of wealth to do certain things, sir. Was there not a time, sir, when in recent memory there was skepticism about a major insurance company that turned out to be correct? I ain't hearing nothing now. So, sir, at least in here, let us, as the Senate of Barbados, sometimes learn to value and embrace skepticism for the purpose of debates. Engage in debates with alternative perspectives, and let's pass legislation for the betterment of Barbados. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Kevin Boyce. Senator Dr. Chantal Moreau-Nagy.
Thank you, Mr. President, for acknowledging me as I rise to contribute to what has been a very fulsome debate today. And I did not want to lose the opportunity, Mr. President, to also contribute to what is perhaps a very kind of insightful and nuanced discussion about what seems to be the simple establishment of the Afrin-Exim Bank here in Barbados. Senator Dr. Christina Hines reminded us that yesterday was Bob Marley's birthday, but I remind this Honourable Chamber that this month of February is also Black History Month. And it is perhaps therefore significant as well that we have the nature of the discussion that we're having in this month. We use Black History Month, Mr. President, to be able to reflect on our history, reflect on where we have come from, to celebrate the achievements of the African continent. It is, Mr. President, part of what I call, or what I reflect on, the collective unconsciousness. And I got that term because it was part of a description of a painting that was part of a collection at the Queen's Park Gallery by C.Y. Hutchinson. And the notion of the collective unconsciousness, it is about that unconscious part of us that still holds on to and still remembers still has ancestral memories. So that even though you are not aware that you have that connection, even though that you're not necessarily aware consciously that you seek that ancestral connection, that collective unconsciousness is what how society, and societies like ours in particular, still maintain resonance with our history and our past. So that we see, not only in the month of February, but certainly the season of emancipation, and we've carried the theme in the season of emancipation, reimagining the past, celebrating the future for some time, that it is about reawakening that collective unconsciousness, that need as a society to be able to come to terms with who we are, what our journey has been, and how that has shaped us. And Mr. President, that is something that is good. As a people, we need to be able to look to our history in order to be able to go forward. We need to come to terms with that journey. We need to be able to make sure that we understand the trajectory of that journey in order to ensure that we do not repeat those mistakes of the past. But I ask a fundamental question, Mr. President, and that fundamental question is, as we do that, as we yearn for that connection, as we unleash that collective unconsciousness that is there implicitly, does it also allow us to look to the future of what Africa has become? Mr. President, our celebrations of Black History Month and our celebrations sometimes in the season of emancipation has meant that we reflect, we reminisce. I love to see the school children, they dress up in all their African attire. We have shows, and a lot of it is about, again, like I said, that pull, that navel string tug that we have of an Africa that we are yearning to know and to understand. But in doing so, have we come to terms with the African continent of today? Or does part of our collective unconsciousness continue to steep us in the past of what Africa was and our history without being able to come to terms with the current trajectory? We've talked a lot today, Mr. President, about how whether it is the media and our own perceptions have forged for us a particular picture of what Africa is. We talked about the images of poverty and dirtiness. We talked about how our own perceptions would suggest to us that nothing good can come from the continent. Mr. President, one of my favorite African authors is a woman called Chimamanda Ngozi. And Chimamanda Ngozi talks about this notion of a single story. So essentially, when she was growing up, and she was born in Nigeria to a middle-class household, her father was an academic. And she was saying, she used to read all of these stories about Christmases and snow, and that is what she wrote about when she began to come into herself as an author. And so her stories very much reflected the reality of what she was reading, even though it did not mirror her actual daily life. So again, that consciousness overrode what she was experiencing even in her daily life, and it was expressed within her writing. And she says of her journey as becoming an author, that it was only later in her academic life as she began to get more exposed to, again, other African authors, that then she began to understand that it was okay, and it was fundamentally okay for her and Africa to tell its own stories and for those to be reflected. But her fundamental point is that single stories often create stereotypes. And stereotypes often become the main story. And the problem with that is that while they can be true in part, they are not complete. And perhaps, Mr. President, our perceptions of Africa or reflections and reminiscence of Africa is also colored because we are only looking at one story of Africa, one version of Africa, connecting only to that single story, that single lens that is fundamentally incomplete, Mr. President. It is incomplete, Mr. President, because, and I say this not at all to take anything from what Senator Reverend Dr. John Rogers indicated when he talked about what was happening in the Gaza Strip. But even as he was speaking, it struck me that we are very emotional, that we are very tied in to the war that is going on in the Gaza Strip, as we were with the war that is going on in Ukraine. We see it displayed, we see the bombs, we see the terror, we see women who are crying over their lost husbands and children, and we feel that our hearts are tugged. We see the socio-political evidence of that played out across Congress and across countries. But Mr. President, how much of us know that in April of 2023, there was a war in Sudan? There's a war that is still going on in Sudan. And that war has made 5.4 million people refugees. 19 million school children are displaced. They do not have schools. Another 18 million are at the point of acute hunger, Mr. President. And another 1.7 million don't have homes within their own country. Don't have homes within their own country. But nobody is telling that story. Our heartstrings are not tugged by that story. Perhaps, and I'm going to make some assumptions here, Mr. President, perhaps we tell ourselves that it's too complex. There's no big villain. It is perhaps black people warring against other black people. Perhaps it is something that should stay at home. Perhaps it is part of a continuum at which the world should not necessarily get involved or need to get involved. Is it, Mr. President, part of that single story that we have of Africa that make other people's story seem more righteous, more just than what is happening within Africa now? But that is also, Mr. President, part of a single story and a single lens, because it begs the question about whether or not within the continent of Africa that you can still have that level of instability, but at the same time, resilience and ascendance that is being demonstrated in many parts of the African continent. And it is interesting when we unpack that question, because again, I think as Senator Reverend Dr. John Rogers was pointing to us, is that we are willing to accept a level of instability in the West. So we hold up as superpowers, America and Europe, with their own level of instability, because there are the sites of financial instability. There are the sites of rampant racism, Mr. President. There are the sites of political instability, the rise of Trump and what is happening within the UK. Let's call a spade, but somehow, Mr. President, we accept that level of instability there. We accept a state who says to the world that it is the moral gatekeeper, well, it is killing blacks and allowing police brutality every single day. We accept that, Mr. President. We accept that. I ain't pulling it back because I'm passionate about it, Mr. President. We accept that, and we still look to them for leadership. But apparently when it happens within the African continent, it is a basket case, Mr. President. That was a term that was actually used to describe Africa in the 1980s when it was going through its own political and economic turmoil. But Africa, still described as a basket case. It is a perception of, Mr. President, as I said, that single story, that single narrative that we have about Africa. But that single story and that narrative stands very much at odds with the reality of what is Africa now. So, according to the World Economic Forum, and also as well, Mr. President, according to the New York Times, the youth bloom in Africa will change the world. That's what they're saying. The growing population in the African continent will change the world. They say that by 2050, the African continent will be the site of innovation, particularly digital innovation and fintech. It says that the growth of regional cooperation within Africa will provide for economic expansion. They tell us that Africa is the site of 7 unicorns, Mr. President. 7 unicorns. And what are unicorns? So essentially, Mr. President, unicorns are emerging areas for investment that are either unknown or niche areas that are then able to achieve $1 billion of growth. And it says that that is happening on the continent of Africa. There are emerging, Mr. President, young billionaires from Africa who are making money, but also as well who are socially conscious and reinvesting back into the continent and changing as well the face of what Africa is looking like. So that the Africa that perhaps a part of the world is seeing is not an Africa with a single story, but an Africa that it is emerging and that is in ascendancy. If it was in another place, I would say the sleeping giant is awakening or has awoken. And so that we place the discussion about the Afrexim Bank and its history and trajectory, Mr. President, as part of that ascendancy that we are seeing, as part of that, not the single story, but as part of the emergence, the re-emergence, the continued emergence of an African continent. The Afrexim Bank was established in 1993, set up in 1994, began full operations in 1994 in Cairo. And I was reading an article by Professor Arama, and he was saying that when they started in a hotel, 6 of them in a hotel in the Intercontinental. And they worked out of there in the Intercontinental Hotel for months as they start to set up this bank. And when they did their research, they realized that the impetus for the bank didn't just arise within the context of what was happening, because it came out of the crisis of the 1980s, so that the Exim Bank was a response by Africa to the fact that the financial crisis in the 1980s led to capital flight and therefore imperiled African economies, who before then were economies as well that were doing very well. And so it was part of the crisis management strategy of the continent in order to establish the Exim Bank. And Professor Arama was saying that when they did some research on the genesis of this, they found that the idea for the Exim Bank actually was born as far back as 1963 in the context of the AU, the African Union, under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. And again, Mr. President, I don't want to go into who Kwame Nkrumah was and his philosophy. But back then, since in 1963, the African Union had imagined its own ascendancy and understood that in order to be able to do that, that it would then need to take full hold, one, of its finances, and to have a mechanism that will allow the country to be able to trade across Africa, to build its own regional cooperation platform in order to support it in times of crisis. And that, Mr. President, is vision. That, Mr. President, is a continent in which you have sites of instability, I say it again, but also as well ascendance. It repudiates that notion of the single story. And I hope that it allows us as well to unpack our own romanticism of the African continent, because I believe that even within our celebrations that we have, that we also have not come to a full understanding of this place and this site that we call the motherland. That we have not fully understand, one, its own power, its own potential. Immanuel Wallerstein was a political, he looked at the world around this notion of world systems. And Wallerstein argued that there was this notion of core, periphery, and semi-periphery. And he talked about this global division of labor with how the world was organized. And he said, where you were situated within the world determined your prospect within the world system. And that there was a deliberate process of structural underdevelopment that took place. But that within the context of the world system and that notion of core, periphery, and semi-periphery, that there could be movement even amongst cores, so the cores could shift, people from the periphery could move up, and semi-periphery, and so on. But that within the capitalist frame, it was difficult, and deliberately so, for those that were in the periphery then to be then able to move to the core, or even move to the semi-periphery, which was really that group of middle-income countries. And it looked at the world in a way that suggested that there will always be that same little bit of core, even though it could shift across countries. But the chances and opportunities for countries who are part of the periphery then to move up were slim, because the core held all of the critical resources that was needed for that development and that advancement. But again, it is because we do not have a full picture or a full story of the giant that was sleeping. And the resources that were there untapped, and the level of leadership that could emerge in order to give and to bring to fruition what was there latent, even though in the context of the periphery. So I tell a story, Mr. President, of an African continent, and the African leadership as well, who, despite being part of that periphery, that deliberate structural underdevelopment, knew who it was. And from 1963, as I said before, there was a vision that was there and that understood the need for what will emerge later on as the Afro-Exim Bank. And that vision has then also extended to its establishment here. Because again, the African leaders, as was said before, established a sixth region, and that sixth region being the Africa diaspora. And so it was not hard to have that connection between what the AfricExim Bank was doing and then the establishment here within the region, because we were already part of its frame as part of the larger diaspora. But there's been many questions, Mr. President, not many questions, but today in terms of this bank and how it operates, and we need to be careful of the operations as we would with any other bank. The AfricExim Bank, as of 2022, Mr. President, had a total assets and guarantees which stood at $31 million, and its shareholder funds amounted to $5.2 billion. So that's 31 billion. And its shareholder funds amounted to $5.21 billion. It has been rated, Mr. President, by all of the international rating agencies, Moody's, Fitch, Japan, whatever you can call, and all have rated the bank as stable, as safe, essentially as a bank that is in good standing for the 30-odd years that it has been in operation. It has dispensed, Mr. President, I believe, over $86 billion in loans between 2016 and 2021. And one of the core elements of the bank, and again, we heard this notion of, you've got to be careful of this notion of the bank. There are different types of banks. There are different models of banks. I think some of us might be familiar with the Grameen model of bank. That was a different type of bank as well. The Grameen Bank was a development bank. And if you look at what the mission of this bank indicates, it says to us, Mr. President, that yes, it is about profit, it is about facilitating trade and development across the continent, but as well it says we will be socially responsible and operate at excellence. The mission suggests that you can have a bank that is profit-making, but still espousing elements of being socially responsible. And if we take a look at the portfolio of the bank, we would understand, Mr. President, what the bank is doing. So yes, it is operating to make sure that it does not have a loss. It has been doing so, again, because of its lessons that it would have had being established as a crisis response mechanism to the financial fallout, to the 2008 financial fallout. But at the same time, it understands its role as a development mechanism of Africa. And so for the large part, its portfolio has been about facilitating that development. One of the very first loans that the bank undertook was an investment of $6.5 million in the Cocoa Board of Ghana. In the Cocoa Board of Ghana, one of the very first loans that the bank undertook. This same bank, again, understanding the need to move the continent, a place that where almost half or more than the half of the population is still unbankable, that it established a Pan-African payment platform in order to facilitate payments across the continent. Last year, in 2023, it also launched a platform that will allow, across the continent, small business players to be able to bid for big contracts across the continent, facilitating interconnectivity and sharing. This bank, Mr. President, provided in the midst of COVID for the African continent a $50 million revolving fund to help countries stabilize themselves amid the COVID-19 pandemic. In the midst of, again, the 2016 financial commodity instability, it provided $150 million, again, for the continent in order to be able to ensure that it weathered that storm. And currently as well, it is investing in the Regional Continental Initiative. This is who this bank is. But it is not only, Mr. President, just investing in those sorts of initiatives. If you look and take a look at the website, you would see that, for instance, this bank is supporting the Africa Basketball League. It supported a camp for young women. But also as well, Mr. President, it supported conferences and processes about thought leadership. And again, if you do leadership studies, you would know that that notion of thought leadership is about spurring ideas, free thinking, about how do we tackle new and coming problems there without limits. So creating across the continent that place and that enclave, again, for new theories, new thoughts, and new ideas to emerge. Mr. President, they're doing that similarly because they also have a technical cooperation fund where they're supporting SMEs, Mr. President. And through Export Barbados and the National Cultural Foundation, we will also be seeking to engage that fund in order then to be able to ensure that those entrepreneurs who are export ready can then also participate through this initiative. With the establishment of the Exim Bank here in Barbados and the 11 of the 15 CARICOM states that have signed on to the partnership agreement, what they have done is to make available a $1.5 million envelope across a number of economic sectors that we then can take advantage of. I think, as was alluded to before, Mr. President, because the bank was established in Cairo, it has also then drawn to Barbados and to the region as well investment from Cairo. So already across the region, not only in Barbados, we have investors coming already to be able to build roads, make investments in renewable energy, agribusiness, and a number of different areas. Mr. President, I'm not going to be deliberate because I think we have had a fulsome discussion on this. But I also want to make a couple of points just in terms of how this links with what we are doing nationally. Because that's as important as somebody said. We have that collective unconsciousness with the motherland, as we say, and so that we are happy that we have the establishment of the Exim Bank here. We understand that its portfolio would allow for a diverse slate of services that are predominantly about social responsibility and development, and that it provides another way that then we can finance our development needs. But this is also part, Mr. President, of this government's long-term trajectory in engaging the continent. And as I said before, you will see that in the establishment of missions across the continent. So that for us, having the Exim Bank here is not in and of itself the representation of our understanding of what that connection should be, but rather it is an additional part of the story. So that already there have been tangible results that have emerged from our relationships with those missions that have been established. Mr. President, the National Cultural Foundation and Export Barbados just recently took a contingent of fashion designers to Accra, where they had a fashion show. And even before coming home, there were already orders coming from that exercise, Mr. President. Our rum, Mr. President, is already being exported to Ghana, Mr. President. Across Kenya, there are a number of memorandum of understanding that will lead to further relationships and exploration and of collaboration with various organizations as well. Mr. President, I've learned even at the spiritual level, some members in here would know, was that we had a remote service between one of the churches in Barbados and church in Ghana as well. So that the attempt to build linkages, the attempt to reconnect, and hopefully not through the single story and not through the single lens by this government, is not just an instrumental one, but it is one that is based on a full understanding that now that the world is opening up and changed, it allows us to look not just to the West. It reminded me, Mr. President, we always say, what was that famous quote? Friends of all, satellites of none. And that we do that in a way in which we create allies and friends with those that are perhaps more natural to us. And the exploration of our relationships with the African continent and the work that we will do with the Exim Bank, not only at the national level, but at the regional level, and also across the continent, will then serve to have what I am going to call, Mr. President, a tectonic shift in the world system. A tectonic shift in the world system. And that is important philosophically, Mr. President. That tectonic shift that is taking place. As we then change the way how we are inserted into the world economy, that we shift the axis and the focus from those traditional relationships that have remained imperialistic to other types of relationships, Mr. President, that are, yes, based on ancestry, but also based, Mr. President, on a full understanding of our shared development trajectory. And that is important. Mr. President, I close with this last thing when I talk about that tectonic shift and how we must change the lens of the story that we currently have about the African continent. As a simple example, we see it, Mr. President, in the music and the dance that is taking over the world. There's an Afrobeat that is emerging. The clothes, the style, the wear that we all thought was part of something that we put on to sometimes celebrate our Africanness has now become mainstream. And Mr. President, if you understand the power of culture and cultural shifts, then you understand once a country has now taken what it owns nationally and has that accepted by the world at a cultural level, you then understand the fullness of the tectonic shift that has taken place and the new story of Africa that is emerging. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Monroe. Senator Nichols.
Mr. President, I wholeheartedly support this bill before the Honorable Chamber this afternoon. I have listened, indeed, I've been intrigued by all of the contributions that preceded me. And I will do my best, Mr. President, to locate my discourse with you and the Honorable Senate this afternoon, not in a repetitive mode. It is important, Mr. President, to contextualize. I had a call this morning from a very senior colleague of mine, and he said that I always want to remind the gathering in which we operate that context is everything. This is a big deal. This is the location of one of the most important supranational financial institutions on the African continent, located in the Caribbean, right here in Barbados. It is not coming to Barbados as a result of any push by Barbados alone. This is, in fact, a regional push, and the CARICOM member states have signed a partnership agreement with the African Export-Import Bank to provide the services that they provide to all Caribbean people. And I say all Caribbean people, Mr. President, not because it's not only governments, but businesses in the Caribbean, financial institutions in the Caribbean, private companies, government institutions, and initiatives by the private sector will all come to benefit from this new relationship. Mr. President, we live in a world where we hear that there is rapid change abounds. And to a certain extent, that is true. But sometimes the change that we say is so rapid is not rapid in terms of its speed, but we sometimes conflate the speed with the magnitude of the change. And we say the change is rapid, but sometimes this takes a long, long time to occur. And sir, what I speak is, what I see is the end of the model of capitalism that pervaded for the last 100 years. The 21st century capitalism that we see unraveling the social structure of some of the major Western powers of the world, the welfare state that was bubbled as a result of the COVID-19 crisis across the globe. We have seen in the last 2 years, Mr. President, the rise of the number of billionaires at the expense of over 500 million people across the world. Sorry, 2.5 billion people, sir. I correct myself, across the world who have sunk and gone into poverty. In the last 3 years, Mr. President, Oxfam is predicting that in another couple of years we will have the world's first trillionaire, while almost 3 billion people will be living in poverty. So wealth for the super rich has galloped on, and the system of capitalism that we understand is being rapidly superseded by an economic system, Mr. President, that is overseen by big tech. So that we must contextualize the governments of the Caribbean venturing into Africa, into unknown territory, to secure an economic relationship with a mighty financial institution. We look at the big capitalists of the world today, they're not reinvesting their profits to develop new capacity, to expand output or increase labor productivity. Mr. President, we live in a world where the world's largest merchandiser does not make any products. Amazon takes about 40% profit for the transaction that is done on its platform. It makes none of the products it sells. If you look at the world's largest video content provider, they don't have any YouTube doesn't have any movie studios. And we go to Airbnb in terms of providing accommodation. They don't own any of the buildings. So that we are now in a vortex of the convulsions created by big tech and their refashioning of the global economy. And some have surmised that we are now moving back into a state of pre-capitalism, or rather feudalism, where we now ply our trade on the land of the serf lord and give him some of the profit. We supply data that is important, that drives the wealth being generated by a few people in the world today. We are all on our devices constantly, and the algorithms are measuring, capturing our data, and they're preparing and finding ways to sell back services to the governments of the world. It's predicted that in less than 10 years, healthcare, education, sanitation, all these services will be provided by big tech because they can pinpoint with accuracy how we operate as a people. And they get that data free because we are on. And this is the world in which we live in, Mr. President. And it is important to locate this development, this mammoth, massive development within that context. When we stand as a republic, Mr. President, an affirmation of the people who we are no longer His Majesty's subjects. It is important to contextualize this development along the trajectory of us being a new parliamentary republic, charting our own course, stepping out from the colonial scaffold finally. And Mr. President, while I don't want to get into a debate on skepticism, I would take the opportunity to challenge some of the assertions glibly made by Senator Boyce. There were no skeptics about independence. In the 1920s and the 1930s, the great pioneers who are the heroes of this country were speaking about independence. Nobody clung on to the colonial scaffold for the sake of so doing because they didn't think that Barbados could stand on its own. Grantley Adams and others, the Right Excellent Sir Grantley Adams, was part of the British Guiana West Indies Labour Congress in the 1940s and addressed the Mourne Commission with the view that the West Indian society should be an independent society as a federation. So that while we were saying there was skepticism about independence, you must tell the full story. So you have to put things in context. But in respect of this republic, that what we are doing, we have told the world a story, and we haven't gone out there with false promises. This is the Trade and Finance Bank for Africa. And when we look at the portfolio, rather than trying to pour cold water on what the governments of the region are doing, and dropping a little thing here that we are in over our heads, and because we are pro-Africa, we are now dropping the ball in terms of our due diligence, and we might get into financial and commercial arrangements that might not be beneficial for the people because we're this pro-Africa push. All of this is under the guise of skepticism. But let us dig deep. And Chair, Mr. President, I speak today because it should not go out that the business that we are conducting is being done because all of us have some kind of unbridled optimism about Africa, and that we are being led to go down this path, and that we don't have brains in the Barbados Labour Party. We're just following this leader. That is the dog whistle that is being blown. And it is being picked up in other places. And so you have to call it out. This bank, if you look and do any research into the nature of this bank, we heard that you don't have a problem with the export or the import, you have a problem with the bank. That sounds fancy, but what does that mean? Sir, this is a bank, as my colleague preceded me, a $5 billion company in share capital. $5 billion. It operates with its financial headquarters, as we heard, in Cairo, in Egypt. But it has offices in Abuja, in Nigeria, the Ivory Coast, Zimbabwe, Uganda. And is now coming to locate in Barbados, Mr. President. This is a big deal. And generations of people in the Caribbean will thank us for the moment we are creating now, in giving us an opportunity to work with this super-regional banking institution that specializes in trading and project finance and export development. And Mr. President, you were a former Minister of Industry in a previous Labour Party administration. And you will know, Mr. President, that there are some who hold the view that there's not a country in the world that has ever developed without an industrial complex. And I'm glad that the export development agencies and the Invest Barbados are trying now to reinvigorate the industrial capacity of this country to help generate economic growth and opportunities for our young people to live, to earn in this world. I'm minded, sir, always to never stray far away from that great oracle of Caribbean thought, sometimes not always given his credit, V.S. Naipaul, who in his introduction of the novel In a Bend in the River, the world is what it is, and men who are nothing and who allow themselves to be nothing have no place in it. And as he was chronicling the journey of Salim as he was going up the river, the graphic and tragic circumstances of humanity that lay before him as he ventured out on that morning. The world is what it is. And men or women who are nothing and who allow themselves to be nothing. We can't wash our hands as public officials like Pontius Pilate and say these. My colleague, Senator Morris, would tell me what is the psalm. Lord, my eyes are not haughty, or my eyes are not lofty. I do not involve myself in great matters or things too high for me. That is what we were taught. Still to big people business. The management of a country today, Mr. President, cannot concern itself with that kind of thinking in a world that is convulsing in the manner in which it is today. This company has over $5 billion in share capital. Its asset base is about $30+ billion. I mean, I have done some research into the company because we hear that we only doing this because there is some sinister plot afoot. And there is no genuine need to have a relationship with the African continent. This is a company, Mr. President, with $24.4 billion in liabilities, but over $30 billion in assets. And when the capital adequacy ratio is assessed at 27%, you can understand why all the rating energy agencies have given a clean bill of health to this company. Mr. President, there has been some doubt thrown about our current commercial relationship with the bank. We heard in a previous debate that the interest rate for the loan to redevelop Kensington Oval and to develop the cricket industry in Barbados is too much, is too high. Sir, the loan is 7%. And nobody is suggesting that the government of Barbados would have wanted, not wanted to negotiate the loan at a lower interest rate. But this is not going in at courts and buying a stove on hire purchase and telling the sales agent who has a commission to earn for how many stoves they can sell at Christmas or over a special given at Independence or crop over that they want a better rate. The world economy does not work like that, the one in which the government has to work in. And the country will remember the 13 and 14% interest loan rates that were prevailing under the last administration. And they talk about the default as if the government, this government and this administration did something wrong. 7%. But sir, what is the World Bank lending interest rate prescribed for Barbados? 8.1%. So if financial institution, a multilateral financial institution, lending Barbados money will look at the World Bank lending rate. They will look at our credit rating in order to fix the rate of interest. And in fixing that rate of interest, they take into consideration the macroeconomic indicators of the country. So to say that the government has borrowed money at 7% is not that the government has sold out the Barbadian people because we're trying to get in with the Africa Bank, as was being suggested, Mr. President. It reflects more of our economic reality. And as I looked at the World Bank table, Mr. President, I saw that the Jamaica lending rate is 11.4. Trinidad, and perhaps that is why Jamaica did not put in a bid for the World Cup. Because Jamaica knows that in order to build up the capacity that it would have to do in the Kingston area, because that is where the stadium is, it would have had to go to the market and borrow at a certain rate that it may not have been able to budget for. Guyana, whose economy is booming, their lending rate, but it's prescribed by the World Bank today, is 8.4. The interest rate, Trinidad 7.5. So when the suggestion is given that we cozying up with the Afromix Bank, and in order to get in, we went and took this loan in order to be cozy, it is misleading, Mr. President. I don't know whether it's deliberate or whether it's out of ignorance, but both are equally challenging. We must stop that. We must stop it. When you talk about the considerations for lending countries money and international loans, Mr. President, the real interest rate as a percentage of GDP. These are the considerations. The risk premium on lending, you take the lending rate and you subtract the Treasury bill interest rate. You also look at things like the interest rate spread, which is the lending rate minus the deposit rate percentage of GDP. Things like the deposit interest rate and the amount of non-performing loans in the banking system to the gross loans as a percentage. All of these are factors that come into assigning the interest rate for loans. So that this government has not gone about the business of the people of Barbados for popularity as is being suggested or implied by the criticism that somebody tell you that the rate of 7% is too high. It is lower than the prescribed rate that the World Bank has set. So it would suggest that the government of Barbados has been able to do better by getting a rate less than 8.1%. And the country must know the facts. You can't just give an opinion that it is your view. And as I said, you're not buying a stove at courts. That flippant way in which we deal with things belongs in another place, in another media, but not in this honorable setting. And that is why I may have appeared to be a little edgy earlier, Mr. President. This bank comes to our shores, and you will see that the bill before us anchors that partnership agreement between the CARICOM countries and the bank, and also the agreement between the government of Barbados. It comes into Barbados like any international institution. It benefits from the immigration processes, duty-free, all of these things. This is a big deal. The people of the region will thank our stewardship of the regional movement and the lead to push South-to-South dialogue on the international stage and to create real and meaningful relationships. Not just to say that we are friends of all and satellites of none and have nothing else to do with the people, but for the first time, real meaningful engagement. I can speak in my capacity as the Secretary of Barbados Cricket Association, having recently signed an MOU with the Cricket Association in Ghana. Kenya is on, Uganda is on. Everybody is interested in Barbados cricket on the African continent because we have an established brand that they want to know about. The government didn't go after this loan for cricket for any sinister purpose, as was being suggested, Mr. President. We have a lot to do to build out the economic fortunes of the country and the people. And you heard from our newest senator, a long friend of mine within the trenches of this Barbados Labour Party. I had to tell one of my colleagues from the other, one of the independent senators today, he is not new to us. He has been long in these trenches. When I joined the party, when you were chairman, Mr. President, he was the president of the League of Young Socialists, leading the young people in the Barbados Labour Party. And I welcome him in my first opportunity to this chamber and to come back home to lead in the fight in the ministry in which he now leads. And I wish him well, and I want to wish him very, very well in that initiative. Mr. President, as I said, this is a big deal, and I support it wholeheartedly. I am obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Nichols. Your Honour, Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This is a historic moment, and I am indeed honored to sit in this chamber today because almost without exception, the quality of the speeches has been exceptional. It is a historic moment because it is evident that the time has come when the children of colonization and domination, when the progeny who were exploited and abused, when the peoples who were dispossessed and victimized and silent and without voice, and without capacity and without agency are determining their own fate and making decisions out of the horror of the slave trade, trying to rise a light for all the people of African descent, wherever they are located. So we who are the sixth region, we the diaspora, who are the sixth region of Africa, we the people of Barbados standing in the parliament that passed the laws that exemplified the worst type of indignity, inhumanity, and intolerable cruelty ever wrought by man against man anywhere in the world. We have come back to this parliament today to say that we are seeking transformation and change, that we are using this same parliament to pass an instrument which helps to make it right, which helps to change the future, which helps to bring Black people together instead of separating them. There is no doubt in my mind that today is a historic moment in a parliament that pioneered slavery, that now seeks, by bringing to our shores the way the slave ships came, by the same route comes the capital for economic hope, a bank led by people who look like us, with a history similar to our own, and most of all with an understanding of our social, cultural, and socio-economic circumstances, and a desire and an aspiration for a common future that is not defined by others, but which we are defining for ourselves. There is no doubt in my mind that this is a historic moment. Capital is at the center of development. Make no mistake about it. Our lands, our people were exploited to create capital, to build society and economy for others. And if we must build and develop for ourselves, access to capital has to be at the center of the development of our people, and therefore an economic instrument or an economic facility which enables that capital distribution is of critical importance. When one reads about governance, development, growth, economic and social stability, and the empowerment of populations, one sees at the center of it strong institutions. Institutions that are able to deliver to people. So what we are creating is an African Caribbean institution that will serve the needs of the people of the region, and which will help to be part of the future of our regions and our history, our growth as an African diaspora. It is significant in my view, and I want also, Mr. President, today to frame my comments in the context as somebody who carries the title of diplomat and works in international relations. I want to frame my comments not only in the history, but in the evolving evidence of tectonic shifts in geopolitical relations and global power structures. It is of significance that the development banks of Brazil, of China, of Asia have far more capital than those owned by whom we've traditionally thought of as friends and development partners, evidence of tectonic shift. The China Belt Road Initiative across the developing world at a time when the developed world is in many respects retreating from support of small island states, retreating from support of developing countries. And this is the year of the dragon emerges, blowing fire, not fire that harms, but fire that creates new excitement, fire that creates new energy. And it isn't that I am just pro-China, sir. I am watching the trends across the world. You measure that against the fact that the United Kingdom is virtually cannibalizing itself. Governments fall in the United Kingdom's like dominoes with men playing dominoes in rum shops on a Friday night after they had too many liquors. They don't just slap them down, they knock over a couple by accident and then say, take that. In the United States, what was considered one of the greatest economies and greatest countries in the world, the superpower, the empire almost without having the characteristics, the traditional characteristics of empire. One sees two octogenarians in Baji fighting to emerge as president. One scarred by personal, corporate, family, intellectual, every kind of taint and scandal you could imagine. Europe, the emergence of right-wing governments that are intolerant of immigrants, intolerant of blacks, intolerant of anything that is not ultra-conservative. Look across the world and you will see the shifting tectonic plates. And against that, read the economists, read the social commentators speaking about the century of Latin America, about the rise of Africa. Read and see for yourself the tectonic shifts. And then it begs the question, sir, the African century and its implications for the Caribbean. We are brothers and sisters separated from the motherland, brothers and sisters torn from the belly of our parents, mothers, brothers and sisters torn from our homes and transplanted into a hostile world where we had to survive or die. So that we come in a post-colonial period seeking a new mindset. And I thought that some of what we heard today in sounding the caution wasn't the caution of the intellectual, but the caution of those who have bought into the notion that in other black people we have something to fear. It was the divide and rule philosophy reigning still. It was the fact that we would accept banks. When you go in Royal Bank, you know who the shareholders are. You don't question their policies. When you step in CIBC and they give you a rate, you say, yes, please, and you take it or leave it. When you go to other banks, you don't know anything about them, but you see, they don't come out of the Caribbean. They come out of the North, so nobody gets in here to caution about them. But today we are being told, oh dear, be wary now, when I don't know who I'm getting into bed with. You know, yes, whatever their business is here. Their business is to do business, to make our businesses grow and prosper. That's what this is about, and that is why we are here. That is why I am going to support this measure, because on this, you cannot be on the wrong side of history. The moment begs us all to be on the right side of the correction of historical wrongs, to be on the right side of the creation of new economic wealth, to be on the right side of building a relationship with our motherland, the real motherland. the motherland where all the resources are, where the economic wealth will be, is and will be, where we all need to get together with discipline to build out our home and to build out Africa and to be part of the new exciting changes and developments that are happening there. So we come as the children of colonialism. We come as the diaspora of Africa to legislate for benefits and the presence of an African Export-Import Bank. And in doing so, we are rejecting the legacy of self-hatred, rejecting the legacy who says that we cannot trust or do business with people who look like us. And we are choosing to build out together societies on either side of the Atlantic, understanding that capital is essential and pivotal for that build-out process. And let us then look at some of the institutions and some of the examples of where we are going in this relationship and some of the things which need to happen. The Road Initiative, which will take place here in Barbados, building out the Newton Slave Ground, creating new museums that are exemplify that period of our history, which will be important for all Black people all over the world, because so much about the slave history, the slave trade has been buried and is now, in fact, being retaught. Where it isn't taught in some schools in the United States at all, and when it is taught, you would get the impression that it was tourism visits of which they were speaking. The truth of the history is being purged from the history books in several places. So this is an important initiative. We talk about Africa. There was a time when Hollywood star shone bright, overtaken almost now in some respects, or certainly shining very brightly is Bollywood. But rising rapidly is Nollywood. And you see the difference between Nollywood is that even though I can enjoy the music and the story from the sound of music, it does not resonate with my social cultural experience as a Black woman. It has no relevance to me as a Caribbean person. But when I watch a movie like Dinner from Nigeria, you see the Caribbean experience before you. Whether you approve of it or not, you see the Caribbean experience, and therefore it resonates with you. So there is no wonder that Nollywood is gaining greater strength and popularity, and that their movies are being watched worldwide. And it is significant, too, that in countries like the UK and Europe, the demographers are indicating that their populations will be majority Black in less than 50 years. And where do you think, to whom will they turn, and where do you think they are going to look for their models, for templates? The heart always longs for home, and therefore turning to Africa is as natural for us as a child calls for its mother. It doesn't matter how good the stepmother has been. It does not matter how good the surrogate mother has been. It does not matter how good the other mother has been. A child turns always to home and to mother. And today we turn. We are putting a marker down. And we are not saying that we are breaking traditional relationships. We are keeping all our friends. But understand, we know who we are. we understand where we came from, and we further understand and recognize the potential that lies across the Atlantic in the motherland. So we have to build out this and other institutions as a society, and institutions which will draw us closer to Africa. And in doing so, we have to recognize that there are still numerous places across the world where there are attempts to create an underclass of those who live in developing countries. That was always the goal of the colonial masters, because you had to have a large set of blue-collar workers or working class people to build for your economy. It was never intended to have a black educated elite, except insofar as there was a tiny clutch of them who felt fussy to be almost white, and who were intent in keeping other blacks in their place. And in that regard, we have to look across the world to see how global institutions are functioning in a way that still continue to alienate us, to exclude us, and to prevent our benefits. There are institutions across the globe which make decisions about our economy and our well-being to which we have no access. They make pronouncements. You read about the pronouncement, and contrary to the rules of natural justice, you have to come after the fact to defend yourself. We go to the United Nations, born out of World War II and the hardships and horrors of war, of World War II. 77 years later, still mirroring a world that does not exist anymore. So that you look at the United Nations Security Council, the premier arm within the United Nations, you do not see Africa having a permanent seat. You do not see small island developing states having even a rotating seat. And we have to fight, and you have to understand that in this regard, our fight and Africa's is the same. It is a fight for a place at the table. It is a fight for national and personal recognition. It is a fight for dignity for our peoples. It is a fight that says black lives matter at the economic level, at the political level. And the time has come when we have come of age and we are deserving of our place at the table, because we have the intellectual capacity, the maturity, and the moral fiber to make decisions for ourselves, for our people, for our own leadership. And we can no longer be sidelined within global institutions. And this relationship is part of our saying to the rest of the world that we have the capacity to build our own institutions and enter into our own partnerships and understand the importance of what we are doing. And I want to make the point, sir, if at all we can get the shipping lines open, if at all we can get the direct flights going, if at all we can build out this partnership, they can't hold me. They cannot hold us, sir. They can't. And I say that, think about it for a moment. Latin America has 21 countries. Asia, 48. The United Kingdom has 67.3 million people. The United States, 331 million. The European Union, 742 million. Africa has 1.5 billion people and 54 countries. Understand what would happen if we really open up the trading links. If we can truly build partnership. If we can build governance relationships, if we can stand side by side on political issues that are important to Black people and to developing countries, there will be no holding us back. We have to understand that when we step out from the shadow of independence and said we are going to be a republic, that what we are essentially saying is we are now a mature people and the shackles are off our hands and off our eyes, and we understand where our destiny lies, and we intend to pursue it as a republic, and we intend to pursue it as a people, maintaining traditional friendships, but knowing that blood is thicker than water and that the motherland lies over there. Mr. President, I want to join with all colleagues who have spoken today in support of this initiative, and to say that it fills my heart with joy. It fills my heart with joy. I want to make a few more points, sir. And often, people ask, exactly what do ambassadors do? I told a young person yesterday that an ambassador pursues a country's domestic interests and strategic priorities by leveraging relationships in the international arena. And that is what our diplomats are engaged in, whether they are posted outside of Barbados or whether they are posted here. And the matter of building relationships and personal relationships cannot be ignored. People talk about ambassadors and the way they're always at social events. You create relationships, you build relationships, you meet people outside of the formal framework, and in that informal space, when you sit down with somebody, over a rum, I'm not a drinker, as those who know me well know, or a glass of wine, or there's a whiskey club at the UN, you get to know people at a more personal level. And so, sir, I had one such relationship. I have been, well, not a whiskey relationship, sir. I built a relationship with ambassadors and members of the diplomatic missions when I was Barbados' ambassador to the United Nations. I have been to at least 5 countries in Africa. And I was on mission at a meeting in Africa and came across I actually overheard a conversation. And when I overheard the conversation, I realized that the person who had previously been ambassador at the UN, or who was well known to me, was actually in Kenya at the time, in the Prime Minister's office, President's office, beg your pardon. And I made a phone call, and he came to see me, and we sat and talked over lunch one day. You see, things happen in the country, and you don't know the genesis. And I said to him, he said to me, you know, my president is planning to come to the Caribbean. He's going to these countries and these countries and these countries. And I said, really? He said, yes. I said, when? He told me. I said, so, let me tell you what. Your president is coming to Barbados. He laughed. I said, well, you didn't give me Barbados on the list. He said, no, that's not on the agenda. I said, no, the president coming to Barbados. And let me tell you what we'll do. Instead of him going to all these countries, we can invite all the countries to come to Barbados and meet him in Barbados. He laughed. I said, you know Barbados well, and you know how comfortable he would be at home. He said, I can't deny that, Liz. I said, so we discussed a visit, the visit of the Kenyan president to Barbados. And he and I sat down and framed it out. We talked about some of the issues that could be discussed, about bringing all the other Caribbean countries here for that meeting. And he said, I'm going to put it to my president. I said, I can call the prime minister tonight. I phoned the prime minister. I said, I speak to her very informally when I said to her, I said, Motley, listen, I just do something that I don't know if you're going to agree, but the president, can't you come into Barbados? She laughed. She said, go ahead, Thompson. And the next day, the diplomat and I sat down, said I spoke to the president, I said I spoke to the prime minister, and as people say, the rest is history. Within weeks, the Kenyan president was here, the rest of CARICOM came into Barbados to meet him, and a new relationship was started. We now have a CARICOM office in Kenya. We are reaching out from there, our tentacles to build other relationships, and it is snowballing, and today we have this bank. This is the use and effectiveness of deploying diplomats in the space, in the international space. Now the difference, and I don't mean this disparagingly, is that because I was not a career civil service person, and because I was a politician, that I immediately saw, having overheard a conversation, the political opportunity, and was able, had the confidence to negotiate, knowing that the prime minister was going to back me up. So when there is a conversation about whether you should choose all career diplomats, or whether there really is a space for politicians, Mr. President, you know. Senator Blackman, you know. Senator Morris, you know. That the political experience that you can bring to a diplomatic post can yield exponential benefits for the country if you use your skills, training, and your networks to good effect. And I am really, truly pleased. My term at the UN was interrupted by COVID, but I'm truly pleased that in the time I was there, we built the largest number of diplomatic relations with countries in the shortest possible period. We started this relationship with Africa, and when I see how it is growing, I really feel as if I have done my work, and I tell you, it fills me with joy. It fills me with joy. While I was at the UN, sir, we established a body called AFCAR, capital A, small f, capital C-A-R. A grouping of African and CARICOM countries. Now, earlier, I gave you population size versus group size, and so on. I want now to make the point that if we can really deploy AFCAR as a unit of solidarity, of issues on common interests between Africa and the Caribbean, as I said earlier, we would be unstoppable. Part of the reason, and this is why those who are watching the tectonic shifts, the geopolitical tectonic shifts as we are watching, would raise an eyebrow in concern. This is a grouping of 68 countries, larger than the EU, larger than other groupings. Only G77 and China would be bigger than it. So we would be powerful within the United Nations system, powerful. And if we can lobby and leverage those numbers and that power in a united, collaborative way to repatriate benefits to the motherland and to the diaspora, we can effect substantial change across these many countries. I want, sir, for this House and the record to carry the names of those persons who were involved in building that group and that resource, and those resources, that grouping. It is my honor to say that I was the Caribbean co-chair. We were led by Her Excellency Keisha Maguire of Grenada and Colin Kelapile of Botswana was the African co-chair. For the record, I will spell the name because I know it would be unfamiliar. Colin, C-O-L-L-E-N, and Kelapile, K-E-L-A-P-I-L-E. On the occasion of the commemoration of the ending of the African slave trade. Sir, please forgive me because I'm trying to open my computer. There is something that I should like to share with the chamber. On the occasion of, it was the very last formal duty I performed before coming home, sir, in 2021. It was the 25th of March, and it was the commemorative event of the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade at United Nations headquarters in New York. It was the first speech made in the United Nations by AFCAR. The speech was delivered on behalf of CARICOM by Her Excellency Carolyn Rodriguez of Guyana. And I want to share, sir, some of the extracts from that speech. Again, I'm delighted to say, sir, I co-drafted it. The issue of reparations is pivotal to restorative justice and to creating opportunity and equity for those whose limbs and lives were used without mercy or remuneration to build societies and economies for others. Ambassador Rodriguez said in her opening remarks, and I quote, "I am honored, and I will make it, sir, a document of the House. I am honored to speak on behalf of the 68 member states of the African Group and the CARICOM community, AFCAR. The horror of slavery separated 12 million Africans from the motherland and created a diaspora in the Caribbean. Separated from our families, now, today we are standing here united with one voice. Given this historic reality and linkage, it is indeed fitting that AFCAR's first statement within the United Nations should come as we commemorate the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, which is being held under the theme, Ending Slavery's Legacy of Racism and a global imperative for justice. Mr. President, as my gift to my nephew for his 21st birthday, I took him to Africa. And it blessed my heart when he said to me, it should be the dream of every black man to see the motherland. I took my niece to China for her 21st birthday. Because I want those who are connected to me not to see only what they are told by Western television and Western newspapers, but to get a sense of what the world is really like, who we are as a people, and the role and space that we can have and must carve out in it. It is therefore my honor today to be part of what is a continuing process, working for Barbados to build its relationship with Africa, and today to exemplify that by voting in support of this measure before the House. Barbados's legislature, by being the birthplace of the legislation which underpinned the slave trade, has much to atone for. And I hope that this measure and the work it can do in relation to empowerment of people, to building institutions, to strengthening the economy, to creating opportunity, will go some distance in bridging a gap, a chasm built in blood and sweat and tears and pain, and that we as a people will work so that the next generation will enjoy a relationship with each other, trustful, cooperating, respectful, and rising as people of the African diaspora. I'm obliged to use it.
Thank you very much, Your Honor, Senator Thompson. Senator Cummins, please wrap up.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to begin by expressing my appreciation to all of the honorable members of the Honorable Senate. I want also to particularly recognize the inputs of the honorable senators on the government side who continue in strength and with substance on details of matters of national importance to address the meat of the weighty matters that this Barbados Labour Party administration brings to this honorable chamber. Mr. President, it is a demonstration of the commitment to the business of the people, Mr. President, that this side has been able to deliver solid presentations on this particular bill, recognizing the importance of a matter such as this to national development, the relationships between states, the work of the various agencies that have brought us here, and the broader geopolitical shifts that this represents in the form of an agreement, Mr. President. There is always going to be an opportunity for the skeptics, and there's always going to be an opportunity, as one of my colleagues raised, to throw the proverbial dog whistle. We get that a lot, Mr. President, but I am extremely proud to stand on a side that spends its time fully immersed at all times in matters of substance. Of substance, Mr. President. That's what we're here for. So on this occasion, Mr. President, as is our way on every other occasion, we are present and accounted for, and on matters of substance, speaking on the business that concerns this government, this country, and our people. So, Mr. President, I want to start by expressing the appreciation. Senator Dr. the Honorable Dr. Chelson Brathwaite, you gave your usual warm salute to the work of institutions specifically focusing on the elements of food security, and I, in particular, liked your contribution on agripreneurs and the importance of creating those kinds of opportunities. Thank you for your usual substantive presentation. It is always appreciated by the members sitting on this side. Senator King, Senator Boyce, Senator Rogers spoke in great detail on a range of issues, and I very much appreciate them. I am not quite sure where I would respond to the following presentation, but I want to especially recommend the maiden presentation by Senator Chad Blackman, who responded immediately after the preceding speaker in a manner that I think is befitting and a clear indication of why he has seen the ascendance to the office of not just the Senate, but also the ministry that he is responsible for. And he has guided us through in a meaningful way why Africa, why import, why export, and most certainly, Mr. President, why bank. I also want to take the opportunity of expressing the appreciation of Reverend Charles Morris, also a new senator who has given his second speech in the Honorable the Senate. He has given us a history lesson as he is a teacher by nature, and he has taken us through a range of historical facts that place into context the why of what we do. And I, for one, have no difficulty, and I believe that over the coming week we will have a conversation on how we as a government and how we as people need to, one, embrace skepticism and skeptics and recognize the difference between substantive skepticism and dog whistles when thrown out, to be able to grab headlines that don't necessarily lend themselves to a genuine conversation on matters of substance that really should preoccupy this honorable chamber, Mr. President. Senator Dr. Chantal Monroe-Knight, also a solid presentation, and I want to express my appreciation to both her and Senator Nichols for taking us through what the bank is, the size of the bank, and giving Barbadians the opportunity to be able to get into the weighty matters of what exactly this Africa Export-Import Bank really is about and what its shareholder base is, the work it has done globally, and why the CARICOM region, why the Caribbean region, and why Barbados specifically is in the midst of a historic moment to be able to welcome the Caribbean office to be based here in Barbados and to have our parliament pass the agreement, which then establishes the headquarters relationship. And of course, our own Deputy President, in her inimitable way, has taken us through and contextualized on the basis of her own lived experience in the United Nations as a representative on behalf of Barbados, why this is important. And I believe that what she has just delivered should be in many respects required listening for many of our young listeners. Now, Mr. President, as I close, I want to take the opportunity to point out that as I speak, I believe last night, today, there are over 300 people who arrived in this country over the weekend. An entity called the Black Feminist Fund, and they opened their engagements here in Barbados on Sunday night. I had the privilege of delivering the feature address on behalf of Prime Minister, and 2+ years ago, in my role as Minister of Tourism, I had the opportunity to invite them and host the board at the time to dinner at a local restaurant where there was a conversation around whether or not Barbados, and we were still in the midst of COVID, and so while we were talking about it, now we're post-COVID and we're having this group right here. The Black Feminist Fund has just closed its conference here last night, Mr. President, and we were able on Sunday night, I believe Prime Minister met with them last night, on Monday night, and we have people here from all across the African continent. But in the course of my presentation to the women and the persons who were gathered there, this was one of the things that makes the air services relationships important, and it was raised by Senator Monroe-Knight. It was raised by several of the others who spoke earlier, and I want to put this into context. There were several persons who intended and hoped and signed up to attend the Black Feminist Fund conference here in Barbados and were unable to do so for reasons that have affected so many other events previously. It affected the transitioning of nurses from Ghana to Barbados. It affected Cricket World Cup in 2007, and for eons, in every different incarnation, we have had a scenario where persons of African descent traveling from the African continent without having to go through certain metropoles as major gateways into the Caribbean cannot get into these spaces from south to south unless they go through north, and north has been denying them passage through transit visas. That continues to be a reality, Mr. President, and it is on that basis that while we talk about the importance of air services agreements, we have to understand that air services agreements remove the power from a third party other than ourselves and those who look like ourselves to determine if we can interact on matters relating to ourselves. And that is a matter, Mr. President, that this government, certainly under the Prime Minister's leadership and the office in Ghana, Accra, as well as through the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport, and with the support of the Africa Exim Bank, we have been working very much on ensuring that we're able to fill both the top of the plane with people and the bottom of the plane with cargo and goods to be able to support the trading relationships that we have been talking about throughout the course of today's discussion, Mr. President. So I want to commend this bill to this honorable chamber, and I beg to move, Mr. President, that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The thanks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that you do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration on this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honorable the Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The Honourable Senate is now in committee.
Madam Chair, will we take the bill in parts?
Please proceed.
Part 1, clauses 1 and 2.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 1, clauses 1 and 2 stand part.
The question is that Part 1, clauses 1 and 2 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. And those against, please say nay. The ayes have it.
Part 2, clauses 3 to 6.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 2, clauses 3 through 6 do now stand part.
The question is that Part 2, clauses 3 through 6 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say nay. The ayes have it.
Part 3, clauses 7 to 11.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that Part 3, clauses 7 through 11 stand part.
The question is that Part 3, clauses 7 through 11 do now stand part. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say nay. The ayes have it.
First schedule.
Madam Chair, I beg to move the first schedule be the first schedule to the bill.
The question is that the first schedule be now the schedule to the bill. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say nay. The ayes have it.
Second schedule.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that the second schedule be the second schedule to the bill.
The question is that the second schedule be now the second schedule to the bill. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the Speaker, the President, now report to His Honour the President, the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The President, the chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the African Export-Import Bank Act 2024.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the African Export-Import Bank Act 2024. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited. Senator Bradford. What do you raise?
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a brief comment on the passage of the bill. Without a doubt, what has been achieved here today is historic.
If you don't mind, Senator Bradford, let us hold that until just before the closing.
Okay.
You speak on the adjournment. Yes. Let's have order number 2, please.
In the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Barbados Revenue Authority Appeals Tribunal Validation Bill 2024.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'm not going to belabor this point. This is, as indicated, a validation bill, and we are seeking to make some amendments to the fourth schedule of the Barbados Revenue Authority Bill Act, which exists already. Mr. President, quite simply put, just taking us through what this is, the Barbados Revenue Authority is an entity that has a Barbados Revenue Authority Tribunal, which is established under the legislation, the BRA Act. This tribunal is responsible for the oversight and administration of disputes, matters in dispute, and it has 4 divisions: income tax, international tax, land valuation, and value-added tax. Some of these tribunals, Mr. President, may meet individually. Some of them may have meetings simultaneously. A simple matter has occurred where in the legislation currently provides only for these tribunals to be chaired by the chairman. But it is one odd instance where in legislation there is no provision for the appointment of a deputy chairman, which therefore allows the effective functioning of the various committees. And so as a consequence, what has happened is that you have had the committees meeting and having delegated persons leading the process, and as a consequence, we're now seeking to ensure that, 1, the appointment of a deputy chairman takes place. That is captured in the amendment to the schedule. So paragraph 1, which is proposed of the 4th schedule, is being amended by order of the minister as already provided in the legislation to have a deputy chairman, and secondly, to ensure that you're able to validate the outcomes of all of the meetings of the tribunal in their various committees that have taken place before. It is a simple matter. This is work that continues. It has been solid, good work done by the members of the commission, by the tribunal, and we would simply wish to have this bill validated to give effect to the work which I just described and to the appointment of that deputy chairman that I have referred to support the work of the chairman and the other members of the tribunal. This is a matter before the Honorable Senate, Mr. Chairman, and I hope that I can count on the honorable members to support the work of the tribunal and the passage, therefore, of this validation bill. I beg to move, Mr. President, that this bill, therefore, now be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Speakers, the question is that this bill be read a second time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do not leave the chair and the Senate resolves itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair, and the Honorable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. I think the ayes have it.
The Honorable Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause 1 do now stand part.
The question is that clause 1 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause 2 do now stand part.
The question is that clause 2 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, would you say no, please? The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. Let me just apologize for my constant sniffling today. My allergies are being aggravated by the Sahara dust. So all the coughing and sneezing and sniffling is unavoidable. I'm sorry.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against please say no. I think the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Barbados Revenue Authority Appeals Tribunal Validation Act 2024.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Barbados Revenue Authority Appeals Tribunal Validation Act 2024. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. I think the ayes have it. This bill is now therefore passed and so cited.
Maybe revert to reports from select committee, sir?
Yes. Reports from select committees. I have received a report from the committee of, presented a report from the Committee of Selection, which met on the 31st of January 2024. Purpose is to fill vacancies which arose as a result of the departure of two of our senators, and the committee considered the positions available and made recommendations as follows. Committee recommended for the Committee of Selection, Senator the Honorable Chad Blackman. For the Public Accounts Committee, Senator Gregory Nichols and Senator Reverend Morris. And for the Library Committee, Senator Reverend Charles Morris. Those were the vacancies. Vacancies were the Committee of Selection itself, the Public Accounts Committee. I should note that Senator Cummins was a member of the Library Committee. She has demitted that office, and the Selection Committee is recommending Senator Reverend Charles Morris. So essentially, the report of the role of the Selection Committee is to recommend to the Honorable Senate appointments to committees. The Honorable Senate will then be invited to show its approbation or otherwise during the process of a proposal for the adoption of the report. If it is so adopted, and we have that proposal coming up, then that is a means by which these members would be appointed to those committees. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move the adoption of the report of the Committee on Selection.
The question is that the report of the Committee of Selection, which I just outlined, with respect to those nominations to fill the vacancies on the Committee of Selection and the Public Accounts Committee and the Library Committee be adopted. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. The report is adopted, and I want to congratulate and thank Senator Blackman, Senator Nichols, Senator Morris for their agreement to serve on these committees. Committee of Selection, Public Accounts Committee, and Library Committee, and thank Senator Cummins for his service on the Library Committee, as well as Senator Roberts Odell and Senator Uritt, who had previously served on the Committees of Selection and Public Accounts Committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, that brings me to the end of government business for the day, and I want to express again my appreciation to all honourable members for their contribution to today's sitting, and I beg to move the adjournment of the sitting of the Senate until Wednesday, February 14th at 11 a.m. Wednesday, February 14th at 11 a.m.
Senator Dr. Bradford, you wanted to speak on the adjournment.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm surprised that I'm being given the opportunity to address you because I had thought I would keep my thoughts for a future meeting of the Senate. But I just wanted to make one observation which I thought would be useful. I'm currently reading a book on 2030, written by a professor from one of the distinguished schools of government of the United States, the Wharton School of Business. And that book attempts to project the new world. The book is called 2030. And it occurred to me in listening to the debate today on the bill establishing the African Exim Bank and the contributions made by the leader of government business, Senator Cummins, made by Ambassador Blackman, Ambassador Morris, Ambassador Monroe Knight, Ambassador Gregory Nichols, and others, that in fact, and of course, Ambassador Thompson, that in fact the combined vision that has been prepared and presented in terms of the changing dynamics of the world today and the geopolitical changes that are taking place merit a profound communication with our people and with our society, and that it should not begin and end in the Senate. I believe there is a lot of pertinent information that should be shared with a wider audience, because sometimes, Mr. President, you would recognize that the people at large, and I say the people at large, the public, is not au fait with a lot of what was mentioned in this chamber today, and therefore have a very limited view of where we are going, or where we should be going. And therefore, it seemed to me, and I've mentioned this before, that there is some room for public education on these matters that are of fundamental importance to our understanding and of fundamental importance to the ability of the population to be carried along with the changing scenarios that are taking place at this level, so that the average person in the street can begin to understand these changing dynamics. It's just an observation, Mr. Chairman, and I do not intend to take up any more time of the Senate, just to say that I think there's need for public information and to reflect on the richness and the important content of what was discussed today in arriving at where we have arrived at to the approval of the bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Bradford, for your observations, and I want to commend all members of the Honorable Senate for the richness and the diversity of their contributions today on this very historic piece of legislation. Our institution, the Parliament, is many years old. It has gone through many changes, and we discharge our duties to ensure relevance to the legislation that we pass and to ensure that it helps to lay the groundwork for the future, and such was our work today. Thank you very much for your contribution and for your service. The question is that the Honorable Senate do not adjourn until Wednesday, February 14th, Ash Wednesday and Valentine's Day, 2024 at 11 a.m.
So we meet here next Wednesday?
Indeed. We love to meet. So it's a lovely time to meet. Yes. We're able to walk and chew gum at the same time.
No.
Yes. The question is that the Senate do not adjourn until Wednesday, February 14th, 2024 at 11 a.m. Will all honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The Senate is now adjourned.